Welcome to the Phillip Jordan Football Podcast. Phillip Jordan and his football friends discuss the latest headlines on the field and off. Whether it's during the season in the fall, countdown to signing day, or on the road to the draft, Phillip has you covered. Now let's kick it off with your host, Phillip Jordan.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into the Phillip Jordan Football Podcast here on Tuesday, August 11th, 2020. And whoa, what a weekend of news when it comes to college football. That's all today's podcast is going to be about, is college football, what's going on. Today's guest will be Matt Murschel. He is the national college football writer for the Orlando Sentinel. Also check him on his podcast, Gridiron 365. And when I reached out to Matt last week, our plan was to talk ACC football. That got scrapped because of everything from Saturday from the MAC announcing they are postponing fall sports, and then the news with the Big Ten, Pac-12, all the Power 5 may be shutting down, and then the stuff on Monday where the SEC may still be trying to play, Big 12's on the fence, ACC's looking to go ahead, players speaking out on Twitter, maybe wanting to start a union. So much stuff has happened over the last 2 to 3 days just with college football. So that's where this is going. This is the stuff we're going to be talking about on the podcast today. Before I bring Matt on, though, I want to let you guys know you can find me and the podcast. You can find me on social media at PJordanSEC. Of course, you find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all your favorite podcast platforms. If you are on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe, rate, and review. You leave a review, I will read it on a future edition of the show. And, of course, you can always email me at sportstalkphillipjordan@gmail.com. And you can check out all my work over at Last Word on college football. And high school football season is starting up in Alabama, so I'll be doing that as well as the in-studio host and producer for Dothan Wolves Football on 96.9, The Legend. But anyways, enough of all that. Let's get into my conversation about the last 48 to 72 hours of college football news with national college football writer for the Orlando Sentinel, Matt Murschel. Everybody joining me this week on the show is Matt Murschel. He is the national college football writer for the Orlando Sentinel, and you check him on the podcast, Gridiron 365. And Matt, I do appreciate you coming on the show today.
No problem. Thanks for having me. Hopefully we've got more than enough stuff to fill up a podcast episode today with everything going on.
Yeah. Because, I let the listeners know this. Initially, when I reached out to you last week and we just got to talk about this off air, I was going to have you on. We were going to talk a lot about the ACC, which they will be discussed today. But after the weekend, I decided today is not the day to do the ACC season preview. I just realized that. So I appreciate you coming on. And it's been the last few weeks doing this show. I've had plenty to talk about, and I think this episode is going to take the cake.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think we look at what happened Sunday, kind of afternoon. We started seeing some groundswell with this idea that the Power 5 conferences were having an emergency meeting to discuss possibly canceling the upcoming college football season. That kind of rolled into this idea of earlier today about, the Big Ten maybe reportedly voting already to cancel the season. You've seen some other news come out with the Mountain West canceling its season. The SEC, ACC, Big 12 conferences still kind of debating on what's going on. A lot of information in the last 24 hours, players stepping up and voicing their opinion to play. It's become, I think, probably the busiest 12, 15, 20 hours that I've seen in quite some time.
Yeah, and for me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, just looking at the whole deal, is this a sign, or it would really help if college football had a leader at the top to kind of help manage all this, because it just seems like the Big Ten wants to do this, and I've always had my opinion, maybe not make any Pac-12 fans happy. They do whatever the Big Ten does. The SEC is not going to do what the Big Ten does. They're going to do their own thing. The ACC, Big 12. It's just so many different ideas going on here. It kind of feels like out of all the times you perhaps needed a leader at the top of the college football and college athletics is missing one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, the word that I've been throwing out a lot is dysfunction. I mean, there hasn't been any sort of cohesiveness between anybody in this decision, which is disappointing because I think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing so much on social media and people going back and forth and so many reports and people kind of just not knowing what's going on is because we don't have that one voice. When you think of the professional leagues, you think of the NBA, you think of, Major League Soccer, you think of NFL, they have a conference commissioner and their job is to basically, be the spokesperson for when things happen. And college football doesn't have that, Now NCAA President Mark Emmert controls, the NCAA aspect of it, but, football has been separate of that for quite some time, especially when, the Power 5 conferences voted to become autonomous and kind of, in a sense, start to break away from the NCAA. He hasn't been that voice. So this is brought to the front of this idea of should college football should they have a commissioner? Should there be one person whose job is to get everyone to sit at the table to kind of decide on things in a good, timely manner and then move forward with that? I think right now this pandemic, what we've seen over the last 5 months, has proven that that's probably something they should look at, because I think at some point, not having everyone on the same page, and if we do move forward with this idea of a possible football season with maybe only, let's say, the SEC and ACC and Big 12, without the Big Ten and the Pac-12, without some of these other conferences, I think it's going to show that there's just no cohesiveness among college football. And I think that's a bad sign when you're trying to kind of put up a unified front, especially when you're battling something that this isn't about money as much as it is about this disease and the pandemic and how you handle it with lives. So to me, to not have that voice has really been disappointing.
Yeah, it has been. I mean, even from the start, back in early July when the Big Ten announced they were going conference only, because it just seemed like from what you saw from the other commissioners, they thought that was going to be something that they all did together. Then the Big Ten just jumped ahead of everybody. Of course, in the Pac-12 did their thing. Then slowly the SEC, ACC, and the Big 12 did as well. And it does feel like, and kind of looking through Twitter, the different reports, so many different reports by so many people. It's just all over the place, but it just seems like it is a kind of like it's the Big Ten and the Pac-12 versus the ACC, SEC, and the Big 12.
Yeah, it does feel like that today. You think about the Big Ten looks like it's going to make its news. As you mentioned, the Pac-12 kind of follows suit with that. I think you're right. They're going to do that and probably announce that they're not going to play a season. And then that leaves ACC, SEC, and Big 12. I think ACC and SEC, mainly the SEC right now, wants to move forward. I think they feel like they have the testing protocols in place. They feel like they can do this and play a season without having any problems. ACC probably feels the same way, but they want to make sure, obviously, that they're taking care of things. And I think the Big 12 is probably thinking, okay, they're the ones in the middle that's probably trying to be pulled apart in some regards by the Big Ten, the Pac-12, and the ACC and the SEC on both sides. They're trying to probably see what they're going to do. But if those three Power 5 conferences move forward, it'd be hard for me to imagine we're not going to play football. Now, that's not to say nothing official has come from the Big Ten. If, let's say, tomorrow they decide after the last 24 hours that they aren't going to cancel the season, they're going to maybe delay it for a month or so, then, all you could see, things could change once more. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier about where's the cohesiveness?
Yeah.
If you're at one point we're hearing that they're going to cancel and then this isn't going to happen, I think that's the thing that's been disappointing. But I think if the ACC and the SEC go forward, I think you're going to see the American follow suit. You might see Conference USA. I'm not 100% sure on that because Old Dominion earlier today announced that they were canceling their fall sports. But I think you'll see at some point there's interest from other leagues in the G5, and there's interest from schools in the Big Ten. Ohio State's kind of come out and said, we want to play. We don't know what's going to happen. I think Ryan Day brought it up today about an idea of a barnstorming tour, where he would take his team out barns. I don't know if that's going to happen. But again, there are teams within these conferences that are upset. Jim Harbaugh of Michigan, voicing his displeasure. They want to play, so it's going to be very interesting over the next 24 hours how this all plays out.
Yeah, because on Monday, and we're recording this on a Monday evening we started around 6 o'clock for anybody who wonder when the record button was hit, if something had broke between when this podcast got released on Tuesday morning. But yeah, because the reports was the Big Ten, 12 of 14 had voted against having the season. It looked like Iowa and Nebraska were the only two from that report, but then you see that they're meeting again. The athletic directors are meeting again. So it does seem it's kind of confusing right now with what's coming out of the Big Ten. But I do kind of wonder if that is true. Could you see a potential with Iowa and Nebraska just try to maybe potentially join like the Big 12 for 1 year, have these teams that aren't going to be playing, their conference not going to be playing, try to jump into another league?
I'm not sure if I could see that happening. I mean, I think if I'm the Big Ten and these two schools say, well, we're gonna go and join the Big 12 for 1 year to play football, I think you'd have to get some sort of approval from your conference, because again, we're talking, the bigger question mark is conference money. You're talking about the Big Ten has its own TV deal with ESPN and Fox. You look at how that's going to be played out if they don't play football. If let's say you go to the Big 12, are you going to share your TV money, from those games with the Big 12? I don't think the Big 12 wants that for sure, obviously, but I don't think they're going to allow that money to also go back to the Big Ten, so that money go to the Big Ten. So you would have to sit down with ESPN and work some deal out to be able to do that. I'm not sure that's going to happen. I wonder if you could play as independents, but again, then you would have to, the SEC is not playing non-conference games, or playing conference only. You'd have to find schools to play, and I'm not sure if that would happen. And again, you're talking about tweaking schedules. They were already kind of announced over the last week or so, which could happen. I mean, I'm not saying anything is set in stone. So that's what I mean. It's a very unusual situation. I don't know if Nebraska and Iowa can pull that off. I don't know if Ohio State could pull off what it was talking about. I mean, I think once your league has kind of announced that, it's going to be tough to break apart and go solo, especially if you believe at any point that you're going to have a college football playoff, which I don't know if they could do it with only three of the, let's say 4 or 5 leagues out of the 10 conferences in Notre Dame. I'm not sure if they could do a playoff with that. They may be able to do that, but if I'm the commissioner of the Big Ten, I'm the commissioner of the Pac-12, I'm not going to be willing to just give up and let one of these other conferences get that college football playoff money if I'm not playing. So I think money is going to be a big issue. I think liability is going to be a big issue. I think that's one of the reasons why the Big Ten is pushed for this. They want to make sure that if something happens, they're not going to be liable about it. And that's unfortunate when you look around and see that the reports that they had some players who tested positive who may have some issues with heart, with coming to their heart, when it involves the COVID-19. So that's, I think, another issue. So lots to be considered, I'm sure, which is what it surprised me that the Big Ten would do something as quickly as it was doing.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point about the playoff, and that's one thing I had been thinking about later in the day was, okay, one, you're right. I mean, the 5 conferences and Notre Dame are kind of, that's a partnership. And also, if you only have 3 of them, the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 12, and you try to do a 14 playoff, obviously 2 teams from one conference are going to get in with the other 2 to let them do it. Would you let one of the non-Power 5 that are playing get into playoff? And then throw this out here too. If the Pac-12 and the Big Ten try to play in the spring, I guess, is that a second national championship game and in the Rose Bowl? It's kind of a weird thing when you look at it from that end. How do you decide a national champion is one thing I think. If they do go this route where those 2 don't play but the other 3 do, trying to figure that out is going to be kind of interesting.
Well, I think that one person I know brought this up to me, which might be interesting, is maybe ditching the playoff for one season and doing they used to decide the champion, with votes, in like the UPI, and AP, polls used to decide kind of the champion before they had the playoff and the BCS and stuff. Maybe you do that route, where you don't play. Because, again, if you're playing some football in the fall and some in the spring, there's no way you can bring those fall teams back to play, late in the spring for a playoff. I just don't think that would be possible. So I think it's going to be interesting. And let's not forget that the playoff management group is essentially the conference commissioners. Conference commissioners and the Notre Dame AD. So if there's going to be a decision about that, it's going to have to be everyone sitting on the same table. And as we've seen so far, the last 24 hours, they can't get at the table and work something out together. How's that going to work out with the playoffs?
Yeah, that would be interesting, like reality TV, if we could actually see that conversation. Might not want to put it on regular cable or anything like that, but it'd be an interesting conversation. We'll have all the teams, and looking at this as well, another thing has really been interesting when the last 48 hours is players getting involved in this. I mean, and Trevor Lawrence feels like the guy that really got the ball rolling with the hashtag we want to play. And then I was just scrolling on Sunday night through my Twitter timeline. It was just amazing. It was player after player after player, like coming together, and they were really trying to let their voices be heard to the president, the athletic directors, everybody, that they want to play.
Oh yeah, and I mean, that to me was, here's a guy who really didn't need to take that kind of, didn't need to step up and use his voice, but chose to do it. And I think it was the loudest and the most cohesive maybe comments we've seen out of anybody, out of any conference commissioner, out of any, we've seen, here's a player who's basically saying we want to do this. And as you said, all of a sudden you saw that movement grow, the hashtag we want to play movement, and you saw more and more players voicing their opinions on this. And I think one of the things that 2020 will be known for, many of the things, but one of the things they'll be known for is the fact that I think the player voices, the college player voices, are really being heard this year. I think they're really starting to step to the forefront. I think they're really starting to realize that their voices have impact. And I think in some cases everyone's applauding them, and in some other cases there's probably a little bit of nervousness. If you're an athletic official, college football official, you're a little nervous because this is where you're starting to see more push on name, image, and likeness issues that they're going to vote on in January. This idea of starting to pay players. I know someone asked me earlier today about, is this the first step towards a union? And I said, well, you have to remember that, players can't technically be considered a union, because you have to be in a union, you have to be an employee, and until players get paid, that's not going to happen. And so, but that's the first step of really starting to see these players come out and decide, okay, well, we're not going to let this go. Who knows? Down the road, maybe you could see something where players choose to boycott a game or choose to not play. I mean, that's the power of banding together, and I think that's something that is great to see in a lot of ways, and I think in other ways it's probably got to be scary for a lot of these college officials.
Yeah, I guess a good example of that would be Northwestern a few years ago when they were going to do the player union and found out, you have to be an employee and all that stuff of the university. So that kind of, I think, threw a wrench in their plans there. And another thing I would think, too, kind of going back to if you don't have the Pac-12 and the Big Ten playing, but the other three do, the transfer portal situation is going to be interesting because you got, a guy, Justin Fields, sitting there at Ohio State. If they don't play, could he potentially jump back in it and try to play for somebody else? All these other players, because I would think there would be some schools trying to poach some players from those conferences that aren't playing.
Yeah, well, I agree totally. I don't know if Justin Fields would jump back into the portal, to try to play. I think more than likely Justin Fields will try to figure out a way if he could get to the NFL draft. There's going to be a lot of these guys. Like, if I'm a Trevor Lawrence, I just say, okay, if I don't want to play, I'm gonna go to the NFL draft. I mean, I don't think he's going to do that, but I'm just saying that would be a guy like that. But I would think it's going to be interesting. I agree with you on the transfer portal, because look at these conferences, the Mid-American Conference, Mountain West. There's a lot of talent there, and these are guys who want to play right now. What they're going to do is they're going to jump in that portal, and you're going to see a lot of these school conferences and these schools and these conferences that are going to probably continue to play. They're going to need depth, especially with everything going on with the pandemic. If you're going to have players, maybe you're going to lose some players because guys test positive during a season, or you're looking at your depth chart, and your depth chart may not be up to snuff because of the fact that you haven't had a chance to practice since early March. In some cases, you're going to get limited, maybe fall practices. You need to build some depth, so you add some of these guys there as well. So all of a sudden, these schools, which already had, think of Alabama, which already had one of the best recruiting classes in the country, year in and year out. Maybe they add players, or maybe Florida or Georgia or Florida State. You start adding some of these players that you wouldn't even think about, that they're going to add them as well, and that gives you a big boost. So, and then you feel bad for those conferences who had, like the Mountain West and the Mid-American, who maybe lose some of these star players. And then coming back maybe next year, they're probably not, it's going to take them a little bit to kind of rebuild those rosters again because some of these guys are gone. So I wouldn't be shocked. Like I said, I think you'll see a lot of movement over the next couple of weeks, depending on once we finally get through who's playing and who isn't playing. You can see a lot of kids maybe jumping around. And the NCAA is going to have to decide where some of these waivers are going to be allowed in some cases to let these players play.
And one last thing I was going to ask you too, because you have seen the MAC have said they may try to play in the spring, and that's been talked about the Big Ten and Pac-12. I mean, that to do the spring thing, that's interesting on two fronts because we've already seen if they were going to play in the fall, players opting out. And I just feel like your best players won't be playing in the spring, the ones that know they're going to the NFL. And number two, we always hear about safety with football. And the fact that you're going to ask players to potentially play 2 seasons within 1 calendar year like that, that's kind of iffy, I think, in my opinion. Where do you stand on the potential or the ability for a spring season to actually work?
I think it could work, but I agree with your points. I mean, I think the what you're going to see if it happens, I think you're going to see a lot of players choose to opt out and go to the NFL route, especially those who think they're going to be first-round picks or first or second rounds. You're going to see some guys who think they're going to have a chance later on. They're going to decide to skip that. I think there's going to be some concern from players who say, okay, I agree with you. Let's say we only play 8 games in the spring because they want to shorten it down a little bit because we're still not through this pandemic. Maybe they choose not to play. They opt out that year and choose to come back in the fall because they don't want to risk that. Because you just mentioned, think about this. You're a star player. You step on the field. You play 2 games in the spring, let's say in March, and you blow out your knee in ACL. Well, you're done not just for the whole spring and the summer. You're done for the all another fall year. I mean, so again, you're looking at, you could miss an extended amount of time, whereas maybe you wouldn't have that issue. Now, granted, you could blow a knee out in spring practice. You can do all that. But I think the amount of physical wear and tear, plus if you get, let's say you decide to play the playoffs or bowl games or whatever it is in April, and that really only gives you maybe 2 months, 2 or 3 months before you're back in training camp getting ready for the fall season. So that's just so much wear and tear on a player's body. I'm not sure if coaches want to see that. I'm not sure if the players themselves want to see that. So spring can be done, but I just think there's a lot of concern with it. And then let's not forget high schools and recruiting and what happens with that because, early signing period is supposed to be in December. They may just get rid of that this year because of everything that's going on. But let's say a kid signs in February and your season doesn't kick off till late February. Do those kids who sign in your recruiting class for 2021, are they eligible to play? I mean, can they play 4 or 5 games? I mean, that would add some depth. But again, you're throwing these young kids in the mix right away where they maybe wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity until the fall. So there's a lot of question marks in recruiting and the recruiting calendar that has to be looked at as well. And I think that's something that can be done, but something that would really cause some major upheaval in college football.
And I can see where some coaches may not care for it either because the spring is where you do a lot of your development for the upcoming season. So if you're playing regular games in the spring, then you're not doing that. So that could be something, too, that a lot of coaches probably wouldn't be in favor of.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, even now, think about what's going on now. I've talked to some coaches who said, listen, I've had kids who come in mid-year, come in June. We're trying to get them on the football field and, see what happens. But we're not able to do that, because, we've had to be sit out. We're at home in self-isolation. Now they're getting on the football field for a couple of weeks. They're kind of behind a little bit. They may have the mental aspect of it because they've been studying playbooks and things like that. But you got to get them on the field. The game is a lot faster from the college level to the high school level, high school to college level. And I think that's where, you're going to see a big drop-off. You're not going to see some true freshmen maybe step in and be able to guide a team, right from the start if something happens. So that's where I think it's going to be interesting. And I agree that in the spring, that's where you typically do a lot of your development. That's where you take some of these young guys and you get them ready to go and get them, once they go through summer camp and everything, once they get to fall, they're ready to play almost immediately. You're not going to be able to do that if you're playing, 6, 7, 8 games as well. And I think it'd be tougher to recruit. It's going to be hard to, for coaches to focus on recruiting while you're in the middle of the season too as well, depending on what's all happened.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be interesting. And I guess now that to kind of close up our conversation, and everything is changing by the minute, by the day with everything going on because of the pandemic and what these conferences are going to do. But right now, if I ask you, what's your gut tell you? What will we see? Will we see college football?
I think at this point, I was 50% maybe a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, 50% we would. I might down to 35%. I mean, I think a lot depends on. I think everything depends on the SEC. If the SEC says no, we're moving forward, I think the ACC follows with them. I think maybe they convince the Big 12. And then I think you're going to see, like I said, the American or someone else try to push forward. I think they feel like they can do that. If the SEC says no, and they're going to cancel or push things back, and that's something that I've also felt could happen. I thought this for months, that it wouldn't shock me if everyone just said, okay, wait a minute. Let's just start the season in October, instead of September. Let's start things in mid-October, and then we'll just take it into maybe January and see how that goes. That's also a possibility, too, where everyone says, let's put a pause on it right now. We'll push things back a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and see what happens until we get more data and better testing and things like that. But if the SEC says no and they're going to close things down, I don't think anyone else is confident enough to follow that without them.
Yeah, it seems like everything's in the ball's in the court of Greg Sankey and the SEC right now, and what they do. So he may be the most important man in college football right now, and those athletic directors and presidents in the SEC. But it's going to be interesting. I'm sure within by the time we end this podcast, some interesting things are going to come out by then. But anyways, Matt, I do appreciate you taking the time to come on this week's podcast. And if the listeners want to follow you online, where can they find you?
They can find me on social media, on Twitter at OS Matt Murschel. And if you go to OrlandoSentinel.com, you can follow all our information, all our stuff that's going on right now. And hopefully at some point down the road, maybe we can actually talk about previewing an actual football game instead of wondering whether we'll be playing football.
Yeah. Hopefully we can do that ACC preview at some point when we know if there's going to be some ACC football games that we originally planned. But it has been great having you on the show, and I do hope we can do this again sometime down the road.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. You stay safe, okay?
All right, thank you too. All right, everybody, you can follow me on social media at PJordanSEC, podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all your favorite podcast platforms. If you're on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe, rate, and review. It really means a lot if you do that. Leave a review, we'll read it on a future edition of the show. I'm debating on doing another podcast this week, later in the week, because I have a feeling there's going to be some news happen at some point in the next probably 24 hours, particularly with the Big Ten or the Pac-12. So, yeah, I'm leaning toward doing another podcast later in the week. If I do, I may hold off and do that on Thursday. But there's just a lot going on right now, lots to discuss. So, and I feel like that's going to be something I might want and need to do later in the week. But anyways, I'll keep you guys updated if I do release another pod during the week. And I hope everybody does have a great rest of the week. Take care of each other. Be good to each other. Do all the smart things. And, yeah, I guess I'll talk to you guys potentially later in the week. If not, talk to you next week. Anyways, guys, till next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for checking out today's Phillip Jordan Football Podcast. Find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Contact Phillip on social media at PJordanSEC or email at sportstalkphillipjordan@gmail.com.